gaslit streets of Victorian London, where ancient powers stir beneath the foundations of civilization, some secrets bind the past and present in threads of dread. Tonight we follow Detective Nathaniel Milbane and his companions as they uncover connections that stretch from sanctified ground to the depths of the Thames. For in this city of fog and shadow, the dead do not always rest. This is Victorian Cthulhu, Episode 6, The Sleepless Ground. The late January morning brought with it the particular quality of light that London manages only in winter, weak, grudging, and filtered through layers of coal smoke until it arrived at Nathaniel Milbane's sitting room pale as parchment. He sat at his desk, surrounded by papers that had accumulated over the past week, documents and correspondence that formed an intricate web of connections he did not yet fully understand. Victoria Pemberton stood beside the fireplace, her dark travelling dress a stark silhouette against the amber glow of the coal fire. In her hands was a notebook, which she flicked through carefully. "The registrations are quite clear," she said, chewing her lips slightly as she read. "Both Staplehurst Sanatorium and the Chapel of St. Joseph in Wapping are registered as owned not by an individual, but a foundation, the Sussetat Foundation. The registry office shows the foundation was formed in 1848 for the purposes of the advancement of scientific and spiritual understanding and preservation of ancient knowledge for the benefit of mankind." Nathaniel looked up from his own papers, his analytical mind immediately grasping the significance. The same chapel that stands adjacent to Thaddeus Wren's vicarage, where we discovered the second vault. Yes, they also own an impressive selection of other properties, including the vicarage itself and... Victoria moved to the desk, placing a document before him. "A farmhouse on the edge of Little Wickham in Oxfordshire. 2 locations connected to our investigations," Nathaniel mused. 2 underground chambers bearing identical markings. "It suggests coordination," Victoria said, "a deliberate pattern rather than mere coincidence." Nathaniel rose and moved to the window, looking out at the grey sky. "After our escape from Staplehurst, you mentioned that you had encountered the chapel's name in some other context." "Yes, during our investigation of Thaddeus Wren's papers. There were references to consultations at St. Joseph's and progress reports to the Foundation. At the time, I assumed it referred to some sort of archaeological or historical society." Victoria returned to the papers spread across the desk. "According to the Foundation's filed reports, the Chapel of St. Joseph was deconsecrated in 1873, 2 years before the Sussetat Foundation acquired it. Reverend Shaw, the priest listed as its final officiant, is still alive." "You've located him?" "St. Dunstan's in Stepney. He's officially retired, but according to the parish records, he still tends the graveyard at St. Joseph's." Nathaniel turned from the window, his detective's instincts engaging fully. "Then Reverend Shaw represents our best opportunity to understand what was happening at St. Joseph's before the Foundation took possession, and what has been happening since." "I thought you might reach that conclusion." Victoria's smile held the satisfaction of someone who had anticipated her partner's reasoning. "I've already sent word requesting an interview, as a journalist researching the history of London's smaller parishes naturally." "Naturally," Nathaniel echoed, and returned to his desk, gathering up the various documents. "And I suppose you've also considered that a retired priest who maintains a graveyard adjacent to a site of supernatural significance might have insights beyond the merely historical." The thought had occurred to me. The morning light had shifted, casting longer shadows across the room. In the distance, as if foreshadowing their meeting, church bells chimed the hour. How many of London's churches stood on sites of ancient power? How many harboured secrets beneath their foundations? "When shall we call upon Reverend Shaw?" he asked. "This afternoon, if you're amenable. I took the liberty of suggesting 2 o'clock. "You seem remarkably confident that I would agree to this course of action." Victoria's expression held a trace of the directness that had initially unsettled him, but which he had come to value. "Uncle Nate, in the weeks since our return from Whitstable, you've been restless. You've been having dreams." It was not a question, and Nathaniel saw no benefit in denying what she had clearly observed. Dreams of water, of depths that extend far beyond any reasonable measurement, of voices calling from places where no voices should exist. Victoria found herself instinctively moving towards the warmth of the fire as she sipped her tea in a moment of silence. Reverend Shaw's home was a delightful, well-maintained cottage aside St. Dunstan's Church in Stepney. The church itself was Norman in origin, though centuries of repairs and additions had given it the comfortable, worn appearance of a building that had served its community through plague, fire, and the general passage of time. Reverend Shaw proved to be a man of close to 70 years, with the stooped shoulders of someone who had spent considerable time bent over books, and the weathered hands of someone equally familiar with manual labour. His hair had gone entirely white, but his eyes retained the sharp intelligence of someone accustomed to seeing beyond surface appearances. "Miss Pemberton," he said, shaking Victoria's hand with genuine warmth, "your letter mentioned an interest in the smaller parishes of London. A worthy endeavour, though I fear St. Joseph's story is more melancholy than most." They sat in his small study, surrounded by theological texts and what appeared to be a lifetime's accumulation of parish records. Tea had been served by his elderly housekeeper, and the afternoon light slanted through windows that needed cleaning, but which somehow managed to create an atmosphere of scholarly contemplation. "I served at St. Joseph's for nearly 20 years, Reverend Shaw continued, settling himself in a chair that had clearly been shaped by long use. A small congregation, but devoted. The chapel itself dates from the 14th century, not grand, but possessed of that particular quality of sanctity that comes from centuries of genuine prayer." "What led to its deconsecration?" Victoria asked, her notebook open but her manner conversational rather than interrogatory. Reverend Shaw's expression darkened slightly. Declining attendance was the official reason. The neighbourhood had grown more industrial, and many of the families moved to more agreeable areas. But there were other factors. Nathaniel leaned forward. "Other factors?" In the final years, foolish rumours began to take hold. Stories of small objects moving, candles extinguishing themselves, even tales of hauntings. I consulted with the bishop, of course, but his guidance was limited. "Did you suspect supernatural interference?" Victoria asked. Reverend Shaw studied her for a moment, as if trying to decide the answer she wanted. "The Lord, Miss Pemberton, is supernatural, but superstitions are just tricks of the devil to weaken our faith." He rose and moved to a cabinet, retrieving a leather-bound journal. "Nevertheless, I kept records of the reports. Not for any official reason. My superiors made it clear that they preferred explanations that did not involve the supernatural, but for my own library." Nathaniel flicked through the journal the Reverend handed to him with interest. Victoria made notes as he spoke. "When the chapel was deconsecrated, did the reports cease?" "Yes, although of course services had stopped, so the building stood empty." Reverend Shaw suddenly appeared uncomfortable. "I continued tending the graveyard. The burial ground remains consecrated, you understand, and until recently, all was peaceful." "Could you elaborate?" Reverend Shaw moved to the window, looking out at the grey afternoon sky. "Lately, maybe over the last month, the graveyard shows signs of disturbance. Graves that had stood untouched for decades show signs of movement. Not vandalism, you understand. The headstones remain in place. The earth appears undisturbed to casual observation. But there are subtle signs for those who know how to look." "What sort of signs?" Nathaniel prompted. "The ground has a different quality, softer in some places, as if the land beneath was shifting, and there is an odour, particularly on still days. Salt, seaweed, the smell of the Thames at low tide, though the river is quite a distance." Victoria and Nathaniel exchanged glances. This was not the first time a case had linked to the river. "Reverend Shaw," Victoria said carefully, "would it be possible for us to visit the graveyard? For our research, of course." The priest considered this request with evident concern. "Of course. The graveyard is free for anyone to visit and pay respects." though I would strongly advise against spending too much time there, particularly as evening approaches, and if you wish, I would be grateful if you permit me to accompany you. The current situation requires pastoral oversight. We would welcome your guidance. We have some colleagues who would like to accompany us, if you could manage some time tomorrow, Nathaniel said. Reverend Shaw returned to his chair, fixing them both with a steady gaze. Before we proceed, I must ask, your interest in St. Joseph's is not purely academic, is it? Victoria hesitated, clearly weighing how much to reveal. We have reason to believe that certain unusual activities in London may be connected to specific locations. St. Joseph's Chapel is one of those locations. Then you are investigators rather than historians. We are both, Nathaniel said. Miss Pemberton is indeed a journalist, and I am a private detective. We have encountered situations that require both professional investigation and historical research. Reverend Shaw nodded slowly. I thought as much. Very well. If you are prepared to take this matter seriously, then perhaps together we might understand what is happening to the ground that I have tended for over 30 years. The tea room near the Tower of London was a modest establishment that catered to clerks and minor officials who worked in the vicinity. Its small tables and simple fare provided an ideal meeting place for those who preferred their conversations to remain unremarkable. Victoria and Nathaniel greeted the Reverend, who arrived promptly at 2:30. Wilchester arrived minutes later, and they talked politely as they waited for their final member. Isabel Strathmore, though small, glided into the tea room with presence. It is a great honour to meet you, Lady Strathmore, Reverend Shaw said, with the deference common to his generation. She smiled in her warm, slightly absent way. I do not use my formal title, Reverend. Miss Strathmore is perfectly fine. As she nodded and greeted the group, her eyes hovered over Wilchester with a frown and an expression of concern. Mr. Chester, you look different. I do? Will looked down at his suit, which seemed to him rather plain and simple. No, on the inside you look different. Has something happened to you? To your spirit, I mean. She was oblivious as she spoke in her light tones of the scowl made by the Reverend, and she continued, It's almost as if... There was a moment where she seemed absent while she was choosing her words, as if you've been stretched out like rubber and then crammed back together. In a manner of speaking, I have, Will said, with a smile as he patted his arms and thought back to his experience at Staplehurst. Hopefully everything is back where it should be. Despite Will's down-to-earth humour, her tone remained ethereal and wistful. Everything is there, and mostly where it should be. Just not quite the same. I have no idea what that means. It is quite unusual. With the group complete, they set out to Wapping. The journey took them through increasingly industrial districts, where the London of gas lamps and comfortable sitting rooms gave way to warehouses, dockland machinery, and the perpetual smell of the Thames. St. Joseph's Chapel stood at the end of a short lane, opposite the now familiar vicarage. The structure itself retained hints of its medieval origins, though later additions and the accumulated grime of London had obscured much of its original character. Unlike their last visit, however, the church was busy. Several large crates were being carried into the chapel by a group of working men. The operation was being supervised by a gentleman in a dark overcoat whose authoritative manner marked him as someone accustomed to being obeyed. That's new, Reverend Shaw murmured as they approached the graveyard gate. The Foundation typically conducts its business with more discretion. The graveyard occupied the space between the chapel and the lane, its weathered headstones standing at various angles like broken teeth. In the bleak January afternoon there was something unsettling about the place, a quality of waiting that made the air feel heavier than it should. One of the men supervising the delivery noticed their approach, and walked toward them with the purposeful stride of someone seeking to assert their position. I'm afraid the chapel is closed to visitors, he said, his accent suggesting education, but his manner carrying an undertone of threat. Private business is being conducted. The graveyard, however, remains public ground, Nathaniel replied with the calm authority of someone accustomed to asserting legal rights. Reverend Shaw maintains pastoral responsibility for the burial ground. The man's eyes narrowed as he studied their small group. "Reverend Shaw, is it? I was not aware the church maintained any continuing interest in this site." "The dead require tending regardless of the status of the building," Reverend Shaw said firmly. "These visitors are conducting historical research, which is perfectly within their rights." For a moment, the confrontation balanced on the edge of escalation. Then the man apparently decided that discretion served his purposes better than conflict. "Very well, but do not stray beyond the graveyard. The chapel is barred to all but those with leave to enter." As the man returned to his duties, Will noticed Nathaniel raise his hand to his temple for a moment and close his eyes. He put his hand on his shoulder and raised an eyebrow. "I feel something. Do you remember how I could hear the wailing sound of the crystal shard? Like that, but softer, almost like an echo." Isabel had moved among the headstones with the careful attention of someone reading an intricate map. "The spirits here are restless," she reported. "Not malevolent, but disturbed. Something is drawing them toward the surface, but they resist." "Drawing them toward what purpose?" Victoria asked. "That I cannot determine from here, but there is definitely external influence affecting the dead." Will, meanwhile, had stopped beside one of the older graves, his expression puzzled. "This may sound strange, but I can see threads, very faint, like silver lines connecting the headstones to something beneath the ground." Isabel joined him immediately. "You can see the spiritual connections? That is remarkable. Your spirit being stretched has some side effects, it appears." "Is it dangerous?" "I don't believe so, although I will keep watch in case your spirit slips entirely out and lands on the floor." Will looked alarmed until he saw the smile on Isabel's face. Her jokes, it seemed, were as strange as her manner. Victoria, who could neither hear a sound nor see spiritual shimmers, accompanied the Reverend as he examined the graves. Reverend Shaw had kneeled to examine the ground near several graves, his weathered face increasingly troubled. "The disturbances have definitely intensified. Look here, the earth is softer than it should be, and there's that salt smell I mentioned." Victoria knelt beside one of the headstones, running her fingers over the inscription. "Anne Mary Lewis, beloved wife and mother, died 1823, nearly 70 years ago, yet the grave feels active. The soil is looser." "It's not just the soil," Isabel confirmed. "The barriers here between life and death have grown thin." Combined with what Mr. Chester observes about spiritual connections, I fear we may be witnessing preparation for something far more serious than mere supernatural disturbance. From the chapel came the sound of heavy objects being moved, and occasionally the voices of the men directing the operation. Whatever was being brought into the building was substantial and was being handled with considerable care. Isabel had moved to the center of the graveyard, where she stood perfectly still with her eyes closed. When she opened them, her expression was grave. "We need to act quickly," she said. "The spiritual energy here is building towards some sort of culmination. If we allow these events to proceed, I fear the consequences will extend far beyond this graveyard." "What do you recommend?" Victoria asked. "There is a ritual I can perform, a severance that will cut the connections between the spirits and whatever is drawing them, but it is quite complex and requires an object which I do not possess." "I see." Victoria tapped her pen as she often did when she was deep in thought. "Is it an object we can acquire at speed?" "It is a device for containing and directing spiritual energy. They are rare and typically associated with those who pursue the darker side of my art. I know of only one in London, and acquiring it will not be easy or pleasant." She lowered her voice so as to exclude Reverend Shaw from what she was about to say. "It is known as the Ebon Reliquary, and is tied uncomfortably to practices of the occult." The afternoon light was beginning to fade, and with the approaching dusk came an almost tangible increase in the unsettling atmosphere of the graveyard. Whatever forces were at work here grew stronger as daylight diminished. "Who possesses this reliquary?" Nathaniel asked. Isabel's expression showed clear reluctance. "A man named Ambrose Fenwick. He lives in Dulwich and has a reputation among those who practice spiritual arts, a reputation that is not favourable." Will he aid us? At the very least it will require some persuasion. I expect his cooperation will come at considerable cost. Victoria noticed that the man in the dark overcoat at the chapel's entrance was staring at them intently. I think we've learned what we can for now, she said quietly, and it appears our welcome has reached its limits. After the group had thanked the Reverend and dropped him at his house, they considered their next move. They agreed that time for reflection and discussion was not a luxury they had, and the plan was made to make a call on Mr. Fenwick the next day. The following morning greeted them with weak but welcome winter sun. The journey to Dulwich took them through South London's more genteel suburbs, where substantial houses stood behind well-maintained gardens and the sounds of industry gave way to the quieter rhythms of comfortable domestic life. Ambrose Fenwick's house proved to be a rather grand mansion with a Gothic style that managed to look both impressive and somehow unwelcoming. Its towers and ornate stonework spoke of considerable expense, but the windows remained curtained despite the daylight hours, and the garden, while clearly maintained, showed an unusual preference for plants that thrived in shadow. "I should mention," Isabel said as they approached the front door, "that Mr. Fenwick has a reputation among practitioners of the spiritual arts that extends well beyond London. He is respected, but also feared." "Feared for what?" Victoria asked. "For the depth of his knowledge and the flexibility of his moral boundaries. He has helped many people over the years, but always at a price, and that price is not always monetary." The door was answered by a manservant whose pale complexion and unnaturally quiet movements felt more unnerving than welcoming. He led them through corridors lined with artifacts that seemed to have been collected from cultures and historical periods spanning centuries. Ambrose Fenwick received them in what might once have been a drawing room, but which had been transformed into something between a library and a museum of the occult. Books in multiple languages lined the walls, while display cases contained objects whose purposes were not immediately apparent, but which seemed to command attention in ways that made looking at them for too long distinctly uncomfortable. Fenwick himself was a man of perhaps 50 years, with the pale complexion of someone who spent little time in sunlight and the sharp features of someone accustomed to observing details that others missed. His dark hair was streaked with grey, and his eyes held an intelligence that seemed both analytical and furtive. "Lady Strathmore," he said, with a rather too elaborate bow, "how honoured I am, and you have brought companions." Isabel performed the necessary introductions with practised ease. Fenwick studied each of them in turn, his gaze lingering longest on Will. "Mr. Chester," he said finally, "what an interesting specimen you seem to be." Will shifted uncomfortably under the scrutiny. "So everyone keeps telling me. Is this why you are here, Lady Strathmore, to explore the implications of this gentleman's condition?" The way Fenwick spoke was slow, deliberate, and oozing. "I must say, it is rare for others to come to me for collaboration." Isabel took a deep breath, clearly steeling herself for what would follow. "Actually, no. We need to borrow the ebon reliquary." Fenwick's eyebrows rose slightly. "The reliquary? That is a tool of considerable power and significant danger. What possible use could you have for such a device?" "There is a situation involving restless spirits and a corrupting influence. The reliquary would allow us to sever the connections between the spirits before any consequences occurred." "Oh, really? A corrupting influence, you say?" Fenwick said, his eyes glinting. "But the reliquary is not something I loan casually. It requires not only knowledge of its proper use, but also the spiritual strength to resist its side effects." "What sort of side effects?" Nathaniel asked. Fenwick's smile held no warmth. "The device contains spiritual energy, Mr. Milbane. When handled by someone with such sensitivities, such as Lady Strathmore or possibly—" He paused and squinted. "Mr. Chester, it tends to seek out and examine the user's own spiritual condition. Not everyone finds this examination pleasant." "But it can accomplish what we need?" Victoria asked. "Oh, certainly. The reliquary was designed specifically for severing unwanted spiritual connections. Used properly, it can separate soul from body spirit from corrupting influence, or consciousness from its physical anchor, or, if you prefer, spirits can be bound. His oily voice did not inspire trust as he continued. The price for the reliquary will not only be fair but beneficial to you. His gaze, almost predatory, settled once more on Will. The statement hung in the air like a threat. Victoria moved closer to Will, her protective instincts clearly aroused. "What exactly are you suggesting?" she asked. "I am suggesting that Mr. Chester's current condition is inherently unstable. His spiritual energy was partially drained, but not completely severed from its physical anchor. The result is a state of enhanced sensitivity that may prove temporary, or may even prove fatal if not properly resolved." Will's face had gone pale. "Fatal how?" "Your exaggerations diminish your character, Mr. Fenwick." Isabel's voice held uncharacteristic irritation. Fenwick continued, talking directly to Will. "Your spirit is no longer properly anchored to your physical form. Strong spiritual influences could draw it away entirely, leaving your body as an empty vessel. The reliquary could stabilize your condition permanently." "And there is also a price for this service?" Nathaniel asked, his eyes watching Fenwick's with intensity. Fenwick's smile widened. "You misunderstand, Mr. Milbane. My offer to anchor Mr. Chester's spirit is the price of you borrowing the reliquary. Remarkably generous of me, as you will gain from both parts of the transaction." The offer seemed clearly tempting, but Victoria detected something unsaid in Fenwick's proposal. "Mr. Fenwick, what assurance do we have that this aid would not involve additional risk to Mr. Chester?" "My reputation speaks to my competence in such matters." "Your reputation absolutely does not," Isabel said sharply. Fenwick's expression hardened slightly. "Lady Strathmore, you seek my assistance while questioning my character. Perhaps you should consider whether your current situation offers better alternatives." "I prefer Miss," she said, her tone flat and cold. "I agree to your proposal," Will said firmly, "but with conditions. If at any point I wish to stop, the process ends immediately." "Will, no," Isabel protested. "You don't understand what you're agreeing to." "I understand that my current condition puts all of us at risk," Will replied. "If Mr. Fenwick can stabilize it while providing us with the tool we need, then the risk seems acceptable." Fenwick nodded approvingly. "Very reasonable terms. Shall we proceed?" He led them through the door into a room that appeared to have been specifically designed for supernatural research. Arcane symbols covered the walls, and various instruments whose purposes were not immediately apparent stood on tables around the space. At the center of the room was a chair surrounded by an intricate circle carved into the floor. "Please sit here, Mr. Chester," Fenwick instructed, indicating the chair. "The initial examination will involve exposure to various forms of spiritual energy to determine your current level of sensitivity." Will took his place in the chair, while Fenwick retrieved what appeared to be a small black-lidded jar from a locked cabinet. Will turned to Victoria and grinned. "Well, at least I'm not strapped in this time." The jar seemed to pulse not with light but with shadow, and immediately upon its appearance, Will's expression changed. "I can feel it," he said quietly, "like a tuning fork, but inside my head." "Excellent," Fenwick murmured, moving closer with the reliquary. "Your sensitivity is indeed high. Now, let us see what other responses we can evoke." Will's eyes glazed over, and he sank back into the chair as the jar made contact with his skin. "Fascinating," Fenwick breathed. "That's too much. You're trying to trap him," Isabel exclaimed, rushing forward. "I am trying to preserve a unique spiritual configuration for future study," Fenwick replied calmly. "Mr. Chester's condition makes him an ideal subject for research into the nature of spiritual separation." Isabel reached for Will's physical form, placing her hands on his shoulders. Immediately, she felt the tug of spiritual energy from the jar. "Will," she called, "fight the pull. Remember who you are, where you belong." "Miss Strathmore, you are interfering with a delicate process," he warned. I am preventing you from stealing another's soul, she replied, her hands tightening. The struggle continued for several more moments, spiritual forces battling in ways that were visible but not entirely comprehensible. Then Will suddenly snapped back awake with such force that he cried out, while simultaneously Fenwick, with the reliquary still tight in his hands, was forcibly flung backwards. He collapsed to the floor, unconscious but breathing. For a brief moment everyone stood in silence, processing the sudden drama. "We need to leave," Isabel said urgently, plucking the black jar from Fenwick's hands. "When he wakes, he'll be considerably less cooperative." As they made their way quickly out of the house, Will leaned heavily on Nathaniel's arm. "Did it work?" he asked. "Am I stabilized?" Isabel considered this as they reached the street. "Fenwick, I believe, was vastly exaggerating your dangers. You still have your same rather crooked spirit, but it was resilient enough to resist the reliquary, so I think you will be just fine." "And we have this," Victoria added. She had taken the device and held it carefully, as if it might explode. "We do," Isabel said grimly, "but using it will require careful preparation, and we'll need to work quickly before Fenwick recovers and decides to pursue us." As their cab carried them back towards central London, the shadows seemed deeper than they had been that morning, and all four of them carried the uncomfortable knowledge that they had gained what they needed, but at the cost of making a dangerous enemy. The drawing room of Isabel's Hampstead home was quiet and dimly lit when the group returned from the graveyard. Evening had deepened into full night, and a hush had settled over the neighbourhood outside. Inside, a small fire burned in the hearth, and the scent of dried sage lingered faintly in the air, a precautionary measure Isabel had taken out of habit. The furniture had been arranged to make space on the centre rug, where an open case now sat, filled with ritual tools, candles of various hues, brass implements etched with symbols, fragments of quartz, and several wrapped bundles of herbs. Most prominent of all was the ebon reliquary, now resting on a lacquered tray, as though it was something far more delicate than it appeared. Will looked tired but steady. He stood beside the case, examining the tools with a kind of hesitant curiosity. "Is that it then?" he asked. "That's what we're going to use to cut the ties?" Isabel nodded, crouched beside the case as she sorted through the bundles. "Yes, the reliquary will serve as the conduit, but it will be your sensitivity that guides it. Your eyes can guide me to the threads to sever." Will blinked at her. "I thought you were the one with the training." "I am, but you're the one who can see them." He didn't argue. He rubbed the back of his neck instead, where the hairs stood slightly on end, as though his skin could still feel the tension of the graveyard. Victoria sat nearby, perched on the arm of a chair. "So," she said, "just to confirm, you and Will do the ritual, Nathaniel and I keep watch?" Isabel smiled faintly. "More or less. But there's nuance. The ritual requires delicate focus, not just silence, but emotional stillness. If something interrupts the energy or our concentration, even momentarily, the severance could misfire. That's why I need you and Nathaniel outside the ritual circle. One of you should be watching the perimeter, the other should be watching us." Victoria made a note. "Which would you prefer?" "I think you'll be better suited to keeping an eye on us. Mr. Milbane's instincts are less subtle." From near the window, Nathaniel gave a dry chuckle, but didn't dispute it. Isabel continued, "The ritual won't be dangerous if all goes well, but if something resists the severing, or if something in the church reacts, we may not have much warning before things turn." There was a short silence. The fire popped. Will broke it with a small, sheepish smile. "Does it ever go well?" "Yes, sometimes," Isabel said, and left it at that. Will wandered toward the fireplace, absently watching the flames. As he did, he paused and tilted his head. "There's someone else here," he murmured. Victoria glanced up. "Who?" He pointed, just beside the hearth, to a faint shimmer he saw in the air, not quite a figure, not quite a shadow. Isabel turned to look and smiled. "Eliza," she said. "She comes and goes. I think she likes the warmth here. She's not tethered, not any more, but some spirits don't vanish entirely when they're at peace. They hover." Will watched the shimmer. "She's looking at you." Isabel nodded. "She usually does." "Do you think she'd help, if it came to it?" "Eliza doesn't leave the house, but she might warn us if we were in danger here. She's done that before." For a moment, the group lapsed into stillness. Eliza's presence lingered, soft and cool, then slowly dissipated. Nathaniel folded his arms. "What happens if this ritual doesn't work?" "It will work," Isabel said. "The question is whether it will be enough." She stood and stretched her hands, flexing the fingers as though preparing for something delicate and precise. "Let's walk through it once, here. Just positions and steps, no energy." They moved the furniture slightly, clearing the floor around the reliquary. Isabel set 4 candles in a diamond pattern. She showed Will where to kneel opposite her and where the others should stand just outside the edge of the chalked lines. "As soon as we light the candles and open the reliquary," she said, "the space will shift. You'll see more, Will, but stay focused on the threads. Don't let your mind wander." "I'll do my best." "When I make contact, you'll feel it. Think of it like surgery. You direct me, I sever." "And if they resist?" "Then we improvise." Nathaniel tested the weight of the walking cane he'd begun carrying again, a solid piece of blackthorn wood. "If something comes out of the ground, I'm treating it like a rat and hitting it." "That works," Isabel said without smiling. They finished the dry run and replaced the candles. Isabel stored the reliquary in a lead-lined case lined with red velvet. She touched it briefly, murmured a phrase too quiet to hear, then stood. "That's it," she said. "We leave in an hour. There are some spare boots in the staff cloakroom if you want to save your shoes." The graveyard was cloaked in mist when they returned at midnight, the air heavy with damp and silence. The faint glow of gaslight from distant alleys did little to penetrate the gloom surrounding the chapel of St. Joseph. The last hints of city life felt far away now, replaced by the oppressive stillness of the graveyard's shadowed expanse. They moved with hushed purpose, stepping between tilted headstones slick with moisture. No sounds but their own breathing and the soft scuff of boots in the grass. The church itself was dark, and the foundation's activity from earlier had vanished. All was still. Will paused near a weathered family tomb, tilting his head as if listening to something beneath the surface. "It's quiet," he said. "Very quiet." Isabel nodded, lowering her voice. "It won't stay that way. Let's begin before whatever's beneath decides to stir." They cleared a patch near the heart of the graveyard. Isabel knelt and lit the candles, placing them with practiced care around the ebon reliquary, now set into the centre of a chalk circle. Will joined her without a word. Nathaniel and Victoria took their positions, one to watch the perimeter, the other to watch the ritual. As Isabel began the invocation, the atmosphere thickened. The air took on a density that made it feel harder to breathe, though no wind stirred. The flames from the ritual candles burned blue at the edges. The reliquary emitted a low, steady hum, not mechanical, but resonant, like a bell vibrating beneath the earth. Will's eyes closed shut, his brow furrowed. "I see them, residues, echoes, faint, but still there, threads stretching from the graves, thin like cobwebs." Isabel didn't speak. She reached toward the reliquary, channeling her focus into the energy it contained. Her fingers hovered above the object's dark surface, glowing softly as power flowed through her. Will acted as her compass, gesturing with small movements to guide her focus from one lingering spiritual link to another. Each time a thread was severed, a light flared from the reliquary, not blinding, but sharp, like a flash of silver on dark water. A soft sigh accompanied each flare, the kind of breath one didn't know they were holding until it escaped. It wasn't dramatic, it was delicate, precise. "There," Will said, pointing gently. "3 more. No, 2. One by one they cleared them, Isabel's energy never faltering, even as sweat beaded at her brow. The reliquary's hum deepened, the circle of candles flickered, as if straining to hold back something unseen. Then, finally, Will lowered his hands. "They're gone." Isabel's shoulders relaxed. She drew back from the circle, exhaling slowly. Then it's done. Nathaniel approached cautiously. No alarms, no screams. That's a first. Victoria, still watching the shadows, allowed herself a small smile. Perhaps we're getting better at this. For a moment, the tension dropped. The graveyard was quiet, still, even peaceful. The mist curled low between the stones, and the breeze shifted with a scent of turned soil and old roses. Then Nathaniel staggered. He caught himself on a nearby headstone, blinking rapidly. "Wait," he muttered. "Something's wrong." The ground trembled beneath their feet. It began subtly, a vibration that ran up their legs from the earth. Then a deeper sound followed, like air rushing through a sealed tunnel. The grass shivered, soil began to shift. A grave nearby bulged, rising as if something underneath were inflating. "Get back!" Isabel snapped, already on her feet. The grave nearest to them bulged upward, not from digging but from pressure. Earth cracked, stone split, and something burst through. It was not a corpse. It was not a ghost. The creature that rose had limbs too long, fingers strung with webbing, and skin stretched taut and grey with an oily sheen. Its face was wrong, flattened and wet-looking, with lidless eyes and a mouth that hung partially open, exposing blunt, barnacle-crusted teeth. Gills fluttered at its neck. Its burial clothes hung in tatters, clinging to its deformed frame like seaweed. Another followed, then a third. All around them, the graves were shifting, splitting, giving birth to horrors. Nathaniel gripped his cane firmly at his side. "They're not human," he murmured. Will stepped back beside Isabel, his voice low. "I see nothing. There's no spirit inside them." "They're moving under a different power," Isabel said grimly. "The artifact's corruption has taken root. It doesn't need the spirits anymore." The creatures stood, still for a long moment. Then, almost in unison, they turned, not toward the group, but toward the far wall of the graveyard, and began to walk. Their gait was slow, deliberate, and completely unnatural, not dragging like zombies, but swaying as though moving through water. Each movement had a strange elegance, as if they were rehearsing some ancient procession. Around them clung a mist that carried the strong salty smell of the sea. "They're not attacking us," Victoria whispered. "No," Nathaniel said. "They don't care we're here." The largest of the creatures paused and tilted its head in their direction. Its neck crackled as it moved, its gills pulsed, and then it turned away again. They watched in stunned silence as the things moved, one by one, toward the edge of the graveyard and disappeared into the mist. Only when the last webbed foot had vanished into the fog did anyone breathe. Will turned slowly to Isabel. The ritual worked, but it wasn't enough. "No," she said. "We freed the spirits, but the dead were already gone." Victoria looked out into the night. "So where are they going?" Nobody answered. They followed in silence. The creatures moved with slow, rhythmic purpose through the back streets of Wapping, their pale forms half shrouded in river mist and gas-like gloom. Each step they took left faint impressions in the mud and cobblestones, which quickly vanished behind them, as though the world itself refused to hold the memory. None of them spoke. Even Nathaniel, usually unflappable, seemed cowed by the enormity of what they were witnessing. Isabel walked slightly behind the others, arms wrapped tight around herself. Will kept close to Victoria, but neither said a word. What walked ahead of them was not spiritual. It was not of the kind they could sense, read, or resist. The procession turned corners with uncanny certainty, bypassing brighter streets and slipping through alleys, and service roads like water flowing through cracks. Not once did they hesitate, as though the city were mapped in their bones. Their gait was unnatural yet unhurried, like mourners in a funeral procession whose grief had long since hardened into ritual. They did not stumble, they did not falter, they simply moved. And the city let them. No dogs barked, no doors opened. The quiet silence of the London night seemed to welcome them. The fog deepened, tasting of salt, and something older, something metallic. The air was thick with the smell of algae, wet stone, coal smoke, and decay. When they came to the waters of the Thames, the creatures stopped. They stood for a long moment on the sloping bank between two darkened warehouses, where the stone embankment gave way to the mud and silt of the Thames foreshore. The tide was out. The river lay low and glistening, slick with oil and secrets. Isabel crouched behind a crumbling wall, barely breathing. Nathaniel stood beside her, his hand resting lightly on his cane. Will and Victoria knelt behind a low stack of crates, eyes fixed on the scene ahead. One of the creatures raised its head, not to howl, not to signal, but simply to breathe. Its gills fluttered, its jaw opened slightly, and then, without a sound, it stepped into the water. Then another, then another. The river accepted them like a mother calling children home. No splash, no resistance. They moved into it with the ease of things born beneath its surface. The four observers remained still, breath held, hearts heavy. Then something shifted in the water. Not near the surface, not near the shore, but deep, far beneath the usual churn of the current, a pressure, a presence, a silence so profound it had shape, a shape that moved. The fog parted just slightly, and for a moment the moon caught the curve of something vast beneath the surface. A back? A shell? A crown of bone? None of them could say. It glided slowly, massively, beneath the water like a submerged continent. It did not rise, not fully. It merely brushed the threshold of visibility and left again. A dull ache formed behind Nathaniel's eyes. He blinked and reached instinctively for the wall. Isabel looked at him but said nothing. The water rippled outward. Something had changed. There had been no sound, no sign, no violence, and yet they all knew. Something had answered. The final creature paused at the water's edge. This one had led the procession, and stood in silence as its followers had paced slowly into the icy water. It turned its head toward the bank. Not directly toward them, but toward the land itself, as though marking the divide between worlds. Then it too entered the river. The surface smoothed, the fog swallowed the trail. Within moments the Thames looked as it always had, ugly, dark, indifferent. No one spoke. Eventually, Isabel turned away from the river and began walking back into the city. The others followed. It was just after noon by the time Nathaniel, Victoria and Will reconvened in Nathaniel's sitting room. They had escorted Isabel home and taken the earliest cab home from Hampstead that they could acquire. The fire had been revived, tea poured, and the curtains drawn open to let in the weak light of a grey London sky. Outside, the city carried on in its usual rhythm, carts rattling past, voices rising from the street, but inside the room the air still carried last night's silence. Will sat close to the fire, hands wrapped around a fine china teacup. His clothes were clean, but his eyes looked hollow. Victoria perched at the far end of the couch, a notebook in her lap, pen unmoving. Nathaniel stood near the window, gazing out toward the Thames, as though he expected something to rise from it even now. None of them had slept. A knock broke the quiet, and Nathaniel moved to open the door. "Professor Blackwood," he said. "Thank you for coming." Edmund Blackwood entered with his usual reserve, his greatcoat damp from the fog, spectacles already fogging slightly. He removed his gloves slowly, studying their faces before speaking. "Your note was cryptic," he said, "but something about it felt familiar enough to cancel my morning lectures." "You'll understand soon enough," Nathaniel said. They waited until he had settled, tea poured, coat hung, before speaking. Victoria began, not with drama, not with embellishment, just a plain, methodical account of the previous night's events, The graveyard, the ritual, the rising, the silent procession, the river. Blackwood listened without interruption, but as the story progressed, his posture shifted. He stopped sipping his tea. He leaned forward. And by the time Victoria described the final creature entering the Thames, his expression had turned grim. "That's not the first time I've encountered such descriptions," he said softly. Will looked up. "You've seen them?" "No, but I've read about them." Blackwood reached for his case and withdrew a journal. He took some time to flick backwards and forwards through the pages until he found what he needed. "This is a translation I obtained some years ago, a Cornish manuscript dated around 1780. The author speaks of those drowned not by sea but by call, human dead that rise from coastal graves, their bodies changed, mottled skin, gills, elongated limbs." "Just like what we saw," Victoria said quietly. "Yes. The text doesn't name them, but cross-referencing with material from Miskatonic's archives leads to a term used in a few 19th century seafaring journals, deep ones." Will shifted in his seat. "And what are they?" Blackwood turned toward him. "No one knows exactly. They're mentioned in whispers, fragments. They seem to exist somewhere between species, part human, part something older, something oceanic." "And the human dead?" Nathaniel asked. "We can guess," Blackwood said. "Maybe they were never dead, just sleeping, waiting until they were woken again. Humans that were never human." Victoria shuddered. "You said the phrase drowned not by sea, but by call. That suggests recruitment." Blackwood nodded. "If they are answering a call, my concern is who or what is making it." Nathaniel turned from the window. "And the ritual we performed? Did we interrupt that?" Blackwood hesitated. "No, I think you accelerated it. The spiritual ties were severed, yes, but the corruption had already taken root. You freed the spirits, but the bodies were already listening." A long silence followed. Will stared into the fire. "We thought we were helping them." "I believe you did," Blackwood said gently, "but this isn't about help." "Not anymore." The fire snapped. Victoria's pen scratched once, then stilled again. Blackwood set the book down. "There's more. I didn't connect it until just now, but I've been having dreams, not nightmares, not random, dreams of water, cities under black waves, beings swimming through halls built for something far larger than us." Nathaniel met his eyes. "So have I, not just since the shard. Before that, I'd see stars, voids, eyes, but lately it's all submerged." Blackwood looked down at his hands. "I think we've been marked." Victoria's voice was quiet. "Marked how?" "I don't know," he said, "but it's as if something's watching us. Not maliciously, patiently, like a farmer watching a field grow." The fire gave no warmth. Victoria stood and crossed to the window. She didn't look at the men behind her when she spoke. "Then we're running out of time." Will turned slightly. "What do we do?" There was no immediate answer. At last, Nathaniel said, "We go back to the chapel. We find out what's beneath it." Blackwood nodded. "And we find a way to sever this connection before it grows." Victoria turned back, the morning light catching the pale skin under her eyes. "Before one of you walks into that river and doesn't come back." No one spoke again. Outside, the sun broke through the clouds briefly. It caught the Thames in a flash of silver. And somewhere below, something old was waiting. And so ends another tale from the gaslit streets of Victorian London, where forgotten things stir beneath the surface, and not every grave lies still. If you enjoyed this chilling tale, please like this episode. Likes, subscribes, and comments really help the channel and allow other lovers of dark horror to find us in the fog. Until then, sleep well and beware of dreams that call you toward dark waters.